So I'm here with Dr. Carl Prey from Rutgers University, a distinguished professor. And Carl, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I'm in the Department of Agriculture, Food, and Resource Economics, and most of my career has been looking at issues of agricultural science and agricultural technology and how it influences the food production and hunger issues in developing countries. And so I've been working on that for quite some time, and then about like 1999, I think it was, after these GM issues really became controversial, we decided to take a look at it and see whether, Monsanto was saying, oh, we're going to save the world, and Greenpeace was saying, oh, we're going to destroy the world, and specifically we're going to, Monsanto's going to take all the money from these poor farmers. So we said, okay, let's go look at and talk to some poor farmers. So that's what we did. We went out to China, where they were already growing some of this insect-resistant cotton, and essentially said, how's it going, so that was sort of the basis of a lot of my research. We did similar things in the poor African areas, where in South Africa, where they're growing BT cotton, and then I did another study like that in India also.
So there are a lot of claims that go back and forth. You mentioned Greenpeace and Monsanto. Mm-hmm. You can't really get more diametrically opposed.
Right. Mm-hmm.
What's at stake?
Well, on the one hand, there's the specific technology that's out there that's available that a lot of poor people, I think, poor farmers could really make use of. And it could increase their incomes. It could allow them to reduce the use of chemical pesticides so that they're not exposed to so many toxic chemicals. And it could lead to more rapid development of some agricultural areas. Now, maybe even more important is that the kind of dampening effect this has had on science. There was a lot of enthusiasm for plant science and plant biotechnology when these technologies first came along. And then as they got kind of squashed in places like India and even China to a certain extent, it's really had a kind of a chilling effect on the science, I think. So I think it's both in terms of small farmers getting access to technology now that is available, but also in terms of a little more long-term, growth in science, agricultural science.
So it's not just what's on the table now, but what can happen. So if you look at GMOs right now in the developing world, who benefits from those?
I mean, the cotton is really the poster child. So the farmers of cotton have increased their incomes, and these are typically in China and India and Burkina Faso. These are small farmers, 2-3 hectares, or maybe only, so what is that, 4 or 5 acres, right. And a lot of them a lot less than that, really. So they're sort of the first level of beneficiaries. Now, with the cotton, it's also been beneficial to the cotton industry. And they get less expensive cotton for producing cotton cloth and stuff like that. A little bit might be passed on to consumers and cheaper shirts or something like that, but not too much of it gets there for that cotton. And then on the other side of it, back to farmers in some senses, cotton's a poster child, partially because they were using so much chemicals on it. In China, they were spraying, 20 times a season. Like every third day, they'd have to go out and spray for bollworms and stuff like that. And so, excuse me. So they are able to have a lot less exposure to those chemicals. Now, I mean, some of the other crops like corn, those are mainly grown in well, of course, in the U.S., but also in Brazil and Argentina and those places, and that's mainly to be fed to cattle in Europe or in China or someplace like that. And it's really only in South Africa and maybe a bit in Philippines that corn is being grown and and consumed directly by people. And so there you get both the small farmer and the consumer that's benefiting.
And you're talking about the farmer and the consumer, and I'm guessing the seed industry is also themselves benefiting.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the seed business, actually, the one that I know best is India, where we've done a number of studies, and they certainly have done very well. I mean, this is the Indian seed industry who licenses the technology from Monsanto, basically.
Right.
And so they've done well, and Monsanto's making some money there in India. They didn't make, contrary to what people think, they made almost no money in China because the seeds were copied immediately and were sold by local companies, and they didn't get any royalties and all that. So they didn't make any money there. They didn't make any money in Argentina, but seed companies made money. And in Brazil, it's a little of both. Monsanto's doing well in Brazil. So it's kind of a mixed picture, it depends on the country and the laws.
So it's okay. What determines, when we start talking about developing countries, what determines which GMO products actually are able to be grown and used?
Well, I mean, part of it is just the market and the conditions, the agricultural conditions. So, even if there was GMO wheat, it wouldn't grow in the tropics. It just wouldn't grow. So the main thing that's determined things so far is what products have been developed for the U.S. market, and if those products fit the commercial and the climatic conditions of other countries, why then they've moved over to those other countries. And so it's primarily cotton. That was the big winner, and then soybeans in South America and corn in South America and some in South Africa and Philippines a little bit.
So you mentioned a bit the role of sort of U.S. and EU, I don't know if I want to call it propaganda, but information for people who are pushing against GMOs.
Right.
If you think about China or Africa, what sort of influence do these attitudes in U.S. and the EU have on the acceptance of GMOs or the regulatory aspects of GMOs in those countries?
Well, there's several different parts of it, if you will.
Sure.
In terms of consumer attitudes first, the elite in Africa were trained in France and in UK and elsewhere in Europe primarily. The old colonial powers essentially, and so they, in their values and attitudes towards things, they draw a lot on their connections and their relatives that are there in France or in the UK or wherever. So there are those kinds of cultural, personal even linkages, and so the concern about GMOs there has led to concern in Africa and elsewhere. The other thing is one other component of it is trade. I mean, there's the concern about Botswana exports beef to the UK.
Right.
Would feeding these beef with GM corn from South Africa, would that cause some problems? Now, it wouldn't, or it hasn't, for other countries, but there was some concern about these trade issues and their trade ties to Europe, even if they weren't very big. And then the third part is the thing that I've seen recently in studies that I'm doing in Kenya, is that the NGOs, these non-government organizations that are environmental organizations and things like that, are often are usually paid for by somebody outside the country.
Huh.
So there's a organization called PELM, which is, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's an environmental organization that's in a bunch of different countries in Africa. And we looked at their annual report, and and they said, well, 4% of our money comes from Kenya. We hope that we can move this up to to 5 or 6 or something like that. And when you look at where most of their money comes from, the biggest chunk is from Sweden. About 45% was from a Swedish environmental organization, and then the next biggest was from German Catholic society, and then Bread for the World and some of the opposition groups. So that they are all funded by the Europeans in this particular case. So I think there are those 3 channels, and I mean the same kind of channels are in operation in through American organizations to a certain extent. So the U.S. government pays for the ISA, the International Service for Agricultural Technology Acquisition or something. I can't remember the details. But that's largely funded by U.S. government, USDA, and organizations like that. And so you kind of get to Kenya, and it's kind of the U.S. NGOs battling with the European funded NGOs in a sense, and it really is kind of an elite discussion. Most of the public is not that interested. That's the same way in the U.S. Most of the public's not that interested.
Oh, that's probably right.
Yeah.
So you highlighted the success of cotton, BT cotton.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any sort of, either failures of note or places where we've missed opportunities that are just things that we really should be aware of?
This whole golden rice thing,
Yeah.
which seems to have real possibilities for providing, higher vitamin A in kids, and I mean it's a huge problem. Nobody disputes that the lack of vitamin A, particularly in poor kids that are raised with rice, and rice is a gruel of rice is their weaning food, and they don't get any greens, and so the vitamin A situation is a real serious one. The question keeps coming up whether the technology is really there and how well it works.
Right.
I mean they've got pretty high levels of vitamin A in the rice, but there are no commercial crops out there yet, and and we hear from some scientists, like we did earlier today, that the rice is not really ready for commercialization. So I don't know. I mean that it seems to have such potential, but hasn't really gone anyplace.